So, kind of an insane game, as you can see. Mm, I am having a bit of trouble thinking whether I'd actually win or not. Not sure what most of these effects do. Thinking face is best, but I'm not sure. Ah, this is best actually. I missed lethal. Yes, that's all right. And that's insanely bad by me though. Yeah, whatever. Should have probably played Shutterblock. Oops. I still don't remember all the effects of the cards, so when I misuse Impact, then I misuse Impact. Though I have so many mana crystals, I could probably still try to BM on them. You could do like Shadow Block into Incendious after getting 2 of these killed. If that's your plan, it's not working. As 3 taunts, I have everything I need. I mean, I could BM with this. Is BMing a good idea though? Let's say yes. Yeah, this is a bit of BMing. I'm very sorry. This sort of combo would never have been a thing back in the day when I played this game. Whatever. I do have lethal, but I don't know whether I want to actually use it. I would like to see what the game brings if I just do random shit. You know? Not sure. Pretty sure they cannot kill me. Ever. This could horribly backfire though. That does have taunt. That also has taunt. Oh no! This doesn't have taunt, so tough luck. Oh no! Fatigued! Fatigued. Le fatigé. I am using this. I am probably using this with something else. Yeah, let's do this first. Bang. Let's do the second. I think. Yeah, sure. Let's do this third. So much mana. Let's actually do I want this? Maybe. Oh, I can't kill this. Ooh, that's shit. What else? Oh, we didn't. Oh, now it's eruption time. Eruption. Will this just keep happening? Maybe. Wow. Oh, way to style. That's quite insane. Yeah, cool. Druid, hunter, or priest? So I need to play hunter. Okay. I guess I cannot play battlegrounds because those don't have like classes. Do I need to make a hunter? Maybe I should like look up what a hunter looks like these days. No clue what the demon hunter is, no clue what the death knight is. Yeah. Core hunter. Okay, I don't think the recipe is any good. I'll also put on Alex O'Connor's interview with Richard Dawkins. It's pretty good. I've listened to most of it, but yeah.
William Lane Craig twice on my podcast, and I always had a good experience with him. Having said that, I didn't debate him. I don't know what that would be like. It's something you're not interested in doing, debating William Lane Craig? Or have a conversation perhaps with William Lane Craig?
I have done. I've vowed not to. I feel such contempt for him because of his. I don't know whether you've seen what he says about the Israelites slaughtering the Midianites, and instead of saying what any decent theologian would say, well, it never happened, and this is just an Old Testament story. He says, well, the Midianites had it coming because they were so sinful, and then if you worry about the Midianite children who had their brains beaten out of them, that's okay because they went straight to heaven, and that finished him off as far as I was concerned. For me, I actually wrote a piece in the Guardian saying, well, I will never have anything to do with him.
I can see why you might sort of look at something like that and say that's an evil thing to think. That's an evil thing to say. I don't want to debate this person. A few moments ago, you told me that the idea of the New Testament in general about being born in sin and needing salvation is an evil idea.
Yes,
and yet. That's an idea that many of the opponents that you have spoken to will have believed. They believe evil things too. So why particularly with William Lane Craig?
It's a fair point. I think that the thing is that the Christian theologians who take this seriously are honestly well-meaning. I mean, they believe in the God of love. They believe in Jesus as the Son of God of love, and so on. I think
I'm going for the beast hunter.
Well, they would never have defended the slaughter of the Midianites and the Jebusites and things in the book of Joshua, and somehow justified because the Midianites were sinful. I think it's an order of magnitude worse there. Perhaps you would disagree with that.
Maybe. I mean, I think there's a sense in which a Christian who believes in the historicity of the Old Testament. I mean,
this is a nice functionality.
Sometimes it's complicated by the fact that it's Moses who instructs the slaughter of the Midianites, but it seems clear to me that this is sanctioned by God. I think that a Christian who believes in the historicity of the Old Testament just has to believe that whatever happened there was somehow okay with God, was somehow moral. Now, I agree that to me is a criticism I make all the time. How could this be moral? But I also say, how could it be moral that God allows children to get cancer? How could it be moral that
yes.
God, and I suppose the thing that I would say is that if you pressed a Christian, well, if there's a good God, why do children get cancer? They just have to say
How do
something
I
like,
craft
there
this
must be some
though?
reason for this. There must be some
Yes, I
explanation.
suppose that if they really do if they really do believe the literal word of the Bible, but then that brings us back to fundamentalist creationists. I mean,
Well,
Can I just
no,
simply
just in
craft
terms
this?
of why God would allow evil at all. What I'm imagining, in other words, is suppose we had this other Christian philosopher debater, and somebody had said to them, well, why do children get cancer if there's a good God? And they said, look, if I believe in a good God, I have to believe that the children who die of cancer are going to heaven. I have to believe that there's some reason for the suffering that they're undergoing.
Yes.
Now, you could say, this person said that kids who have cancer, they should be grateful because they're going straight to heaven, and there's some reason to give children cancer. That's despicable. I want nothing to do with this person. I'll never debate them. However, I would suppose that basically everybody that you've debated on the topic of Christianity would say something like that about
yes,
cancer
they
in
probably
children.
would.
And so I wonder why with William Lane Craig it's a particular problem.
You make a good point. I suppose none of these sophisticated theologians take the literal word of the Old Testament seriously. I mean, they don't believe in Adam and Eve, for example. They don't believe in therefore, why would you believe that the story of the Midianites is history? Why not just sort of say, well, this is some kind of tribal myth, and all sorts of tribes have these horrible.
Well, I can keep up this God's advocate, if you like. I would say, in other words, I would answer that question with a Christian hat on by saying that the Bible is a collection of books rather than a book, and that book contains different genres, and that the genre of Genesis is something like poetry.
Exactly.
The genre of Numbers seems much more to be, at least intended to be, history, in a way that the genre of Paul is letters, it's epistles.
Yes.
Whether or not you think he actually even existed, I mean, I think Paul existed, just to be clear, but it doesn't really matter. It's still clear that if you think that it's true, the kind of thing that Paul's doing is writing letters, the kind of thing that Acts is doing is essentially biography or history, it's attempting to do that. It seems to me that where Numbers is very obviously trying to just recount historical events, Genesis seems a lot more allegorical to me, and so it doesn't seem inconsistent for me to say, well, of course I don't believe in Adam and Eve, I believe in the 7-day creation, but I do believe that there was a real slaughter of the Midianites by Moses and his armies.
Well, yes, and then, I mean, I don't think you should then go ahead to justify it, but by
Quite right, yeah.
they were sinful. I mean, I should have thought that the right and proper thing for a Christian to say is the slaughter of the Midianites is no more factual history than the story of Jupiter or Apollo, Thor with his hammer and things. These are tribal myths, which we could study as mythology. But why go out of your way to make it sound much more evil than it really is? By saying, well, the Midianites were sinful and their children were going to heaven anyway. It's somehow, I just find it more appalling. Perhaps I'm wrong, but I find it sort of appalling that you take it so seriously, that you actually, well, you take the belief in the historicity of it so seriously that you even defend it rather than just say, as any decent bishop would say, well, it's never happened.
I think that, as particularly at the height of the new atheism and religion debates that were happening in the sort of late 2000s, I think a lot of people were disappointed that the forerunner of the atheist side, Richard Dawkins, and arguably the forerunner of the Christian side, William Lane Craig, never came together to have that debate, because even if you do think that what he believes there is particularly and specifically evil, I suppose everything you've just said to me, people would probably just like to see you say that to William Lane Craig.
I wrote an article in The Guardian saying it, and I did in fact have a debate with him in Mexico, I forget when.
With the boxing ring.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just no desire to I don't respect him. I find his manner pompous, and I just don't want to be in the same room as him, really.
Well, in the interest of diplomacy, I will offer no further comment, except that that's certainly not my experience with the man. But
okay,
I imagine that we've had very different interactions with him in the past. Let's put it that way. Well, on this topic of debates and arguments for God's existence, anyway, I suppose what I wanted to do was ask you about two arguments that I've been thinking about related to God's existence, but specifically related to evolution and naturalism as well, because I think that these are questions which I'm sure you've commented on before somewhere, but I guess I'd like to probe again.
Yeah.
One of these is Lewis's argument from desire, which sounds like a very silly argument on the face of it. He essentially says something along the lines of, look, everybody seems to have an innate desire for something a bit beyond the natural, something a bit supernatural, something, beauty, purpose, this kind of intangible stuff. And he says, I actually wrote down the way he puts it in Mere Christianity. He says most people, if they'd really learn to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to them, that offer to give it to you, but never quite keep their promise. And then later, if I find in myself a desire, which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And like I say, on the face of it, that sounds maybe a little bit silly. But there is a serious question in here that most of the time when we evolve a desire for something, we evolve a desire for food, for warmth, this kind of thing. The reason for that is because this desire gives us reason to seek out those things in the real world. If there were no food and digestion, if there were no temperature, it would make no sense for us to evolve a desire for food, for temperature, for warmth. That wouldn't make any sense. Why would that even evolve in the first place if it doesn't actually latch on to anything in the real world? And although I'm not sure if Lewis was aware of this, we know anthropologically that almost everywhere we look in the world, we find people with religious sensibilities. They have some kind of either desire or apprehension of something beyond themselves, something divine. And I suppose the question Lewis asks is, from an evolutionary perspective, why would it be that we would universally evolve that desire if that desire doesn't actually latch onto anything in reality?
That's a very odd argument. Because we have a desire to survive and live, which makes perfect evolutionary sense. It's a natural projection of that desire, that we might desire to go on living after we die, a desire for eternal life. You know, you could easily see that as just an extension of the perfectly Darwinian desire to go on living.
That's quite
I
good.
think it's just another example of that. That particular part of it is, I suppose. What else did he say? The
Misha.
desire for something beyond.
He says, want acutely something that cannot be had in this world. I mean, he says a lot more about it in Mere Christianity, but he says, if I find it myself in a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world.
Yes, I mean, the idea that because you want something, therefore it must be true, I find that a most extraordinary idea.
It does seem strange to want something that doesn't exist.
Why?
Because if we're trying to give an account of where this desire comes from, it seems to have to latch onto something. And it seems like what you're suggesting is that what it's latching onto is just the general desire to stay alive as long as possible.
Well, that I was thinking specifically of the desire for eternal life, sure, but I think you can do a kind of version of that for whatever else C.S. Lewis was saying. Some people may have a sexual desire for a film star that they're never going to meet and wouldn't look at them if they did, and that doesn't mean that there's anything realistic about it. It's a natural extension of sexual desire.
But of course, the film star exists.
Well, it doesn't exist as in any realistic sense as far as this wretched person is concerned.
Sure.
I mean, you could talk about a desire for 72 virgins in Islamic heaven. That doesn't exist. But it's easy to see it as a projection of an ordinary biological desire.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you, maybe if not in the detail, with the suggestion that the desire can be for something real, and that the image of God or afterlife or eternality are just sort of warped or extended versions of a real thing. That is, the afterlife is an extension of the desire to be alive.
I mean, a physicist might desire a solution to the theory of everything and the unification of gravity and quantum theory.
Yeah, that's what C.S. Lewis says. They desire God.
You desire a solution to a physical problem which may be insoluble.
I'm pulling your leg.
It may be out of this world in the sense that it's beyond solution. C.S. Lewis better come up with a better argument than that.
Well, C.S. Lewis has another argument for you, which is the argument from reason. And I actually want to give you a version of it that's more modern, but that I'm sure you'll have talked about before, which is Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. I want to know what you think about this because, I'm sat with one of the most preeminent evolutionary biologists in living memory, and I would love to know what you think about this. Now, Plantinga points out that if we're a materialist, if we don't believe in the existence of a mind governing all of this, and everything evolves according to natural selection, well, what does natural selection select for? Survivability. Therefore, everything which evolves because it helps us to survive, including our minds, including our rationality. And so, why is it that we believe that evolution occurred by natural selection? Because we look at the evidence, and we use our rationality to come to the conclusion that natural selection is the best explanation. But what we're doing, in assenting to the truth of natural selection, is saying that the mechanism we use to believe in natural selection doesn't actually select for truth. It selects for survivability. We can't know that 2 + 2 = 4 is true, or if it's just that believing 2 + 2 = 4 is beneficial for our survival. If the latter is the case, then we run into a lot of trouble. And it seems that when we say evolution is true, therefore our brain evolved for survivability, we've just undermined the truth aptness of the very process that we've used to believe in evolution.
Yeah, I've never understood why people are at all persuaded by this. If any animal went through life, particularly humans, went through life believing the equivalent of 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4, we would survive. I mean, if you base your life upon evidence, if you base your life upon rationality, you're more likely to survive than if you base your life upon nonsense. And it just seems to me to be so easy to say that rationality and the search for truth, the search for evidence, is a good way to live, even from a mundane Darwinian point of view.
When you say a moment ago, if we were to live as if 2 + 2 didn't equal 4, I suppose what I'm saying is we have no way to ascertain whether it's actually true. I mean, you can. Are you saying something like, if the thing that we thought was true was not actually true, we just wouldn't be able to survive, or something like that?
Yes.
Is it not conceivable that there could be things that we believe that are not true, but by believing them to be true, actually make us more likely?
Oh yes, I mean, there is some evidence for that. There's some evidence that having a somewhat inflated belief in your own ability is beneficial.
Right.
So there is evidence that people in general think they're better looking than they are, think they're cleverer than they are, think they're better drivers than they are, etc. And there could be a certain one at least could make an interesting case that self-deception of this kind. Robert Trivers, one of the great figures in my field, even wrote a book called The Folly of Fools about self-deception and the Darwinian advantage of
That's
self-deception.
spicy.
It's got to be pretty limited. I mean, it would be a little bit of an icing, a little bit of a glass on top of a fundamentally rational.
I think that's the point that someone like Plantinga might wish to push back on, which is to say, how can we know that in some instances, sure, believing something that's actually false is beneficial for our survival, and so we've evolved like a mechanism to just naturally think that it's true. But that definitely doesn't happen when we do math. So that definitely doesn't happen when we're sort of doing empirical observation about, the shape and size of things. We know that that doesn't happen. Well, how do we know that?
Well, we know that science works. I mean, we know that if you follow scientific principles, you can get to Pluto, and it works over and over and over again. You cure smallpox. You slingshot rockets around Venus and Earth and get to Jupiter. All this works, and scientific predictions come out right. You can predict when eclipses will occur. It works.
I suppose the analogy there would be somebody would ask, well, then how do you know that 2 + 2 = 4 in the abstract mathematical realm is just true, rather than it being the case that thinking or acting as if 2 + 2 = 4 helps us get to the moon?
I think 2 + 2 = 4 is a different matter from getting to the moon. I mean, that's just logic.
Well, I suppose, mathematical truth and logic in general.
Yes.
I'm using 2 + 2 as a
truth.
representative of that, yeah.
Yes. I don't see the problem with that. I mean,
well, maybe there is then. Maybe there is. I just wanted to get your thoughts, and I suppose I'll be interested to see what people make of your reply. One of the biggest reasons why people are religious, arguably, at least from a sort of cynical atheist perspective, is to escape the fear of death. Sigmund Freud said that there'll be religion as long as we're afraid of death. Are you afraid of death?
I'm afraid of dying. I don't look forward to, I don't know, getting cancer or something of that sort. I suppose I'm afraid of eternity. It is a daunting thought that the universe goes on and on and on and on and on and on for billions, for trillions of years. So I've said this often enough before, that the escape from eternity would be the escape from any kind of pain, would be a general anesthetic, and which I think is what death is. So it's a nothingness, just like a general anesthetic. I like life, and I like to go on living. I enjoy life, and I'm curious to know how the future will unfold. So I would like to go on. So I wouldn't mind living for 200 years, but I wouldn't like to live for eternity.
No. What consolation might you offer to, say, somebody's read The God Delusion and they become convinced that God doesn't exist and there is no afterlife, and they feel pretty fine about that, except for this one thing, that they've now had to give up the idea that they're going to be able to escape death. And they say, well, I'm really happy for you, Professor Dawkins, that you're not afraid of death, but I still am. I'm afraid of the unknown. What advice would you give to them?
It's very hard to say. I'm under no obligation to give any consolation, of course.
Well, that's true.
I certainly think that the fact that a belief gives you consolation is no reason to think it's true, and what I care about is what's true. If they're not consoled by what I've just said about general anesthetics, I have to scratch my head and try to think of something else, but I find it a hard job to do that. I think that enjoy your life to the full while you've got it. You won't regret it when you're dead because you won't be there. So don't spoil your life by fretting about the fact that it's got to come to an end. Fill it with not selfish pleasures, but fill it with pleasure and pleasure for other people as well.
And perhaps its eternity would actually diminish its value in the sense that having $1 billion in the bank account makes $1 not worth very much. But if you've only got 10, then a dollar sort of becomes everything to you.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Professor Richard Dawkins, thank you for your time. If you enjoyed that conversation, you can watch more episodes of the Within Reason podcast by clicking just here. But remember, the show is also on streaming platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. William Lane Craig, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Alex. It is really good to be with you again.
Broadly speaking, what are your opinions of Richard Dawkins?
I think he is a very engaging public speaker and interviewer. He's very urbane and comes across as extremely sophisticated. He has wonderful aesthetic tastes and a wide range of interests. So I find a lot to like about him on a personal level, but I sharply disagree with his views. I think that he is very naive philosophically and theologically, which is fairly typical for someone engaged in the physical sciences. Every one of us who tries to do cross-disciplinary work finds himself disadvantaged in that area or field with which he is less familiar. And I think that Dawkins hasn't made a serious effort to try to understand philosophy or theology.
Now, you'll probably know that the reason I'm asking you this is because I recently had Richard Dawkins on my own show, and he had some choice words for you. I didn't bring you up. He brought you up and decided to, well, I'll play a clip for our listeners in case they missed it.
I mean, the sort of professional debaters on behalf of religion, people like William Craig, I've no time for him. I mean, he's got this sort of loud, rather pompous voice, and he says premise 1, deduction 2, and things like that, and the audience, I suppose, is supposed to be impressed.
I've had William Lane Craig twice on my podcast, and I always had a good experience with him. Having said that, I didn't debate him. I don't know what that would be like. It's something you're not interested in doing, debating William Lane Craig, or have a conversation perhaps with William Lane Craig.
I have done. I've vowed not to. I feel such contempt for him because of his. I don't know whether you've seen what he says about the
Something about
Israelites slaughtering the Midianites, and instead of saying what any decent theologian would say, well, it never happened, and this is just an Old Testament story, he says, well, the Midianites had it coming because they were so sinful, and then if you worry about the Midianite children who had their brains beaten out of them, that's okay because they went straight to heaven, and that finished him off as far as I was concerned. Now, for me, I actually wrote a piece in the Guardian saying, well, I will never have anything to do with him.
I suppose, before getting into his specific criticisms and giving you an opportunity, I suppose this is something of a right of reply. I mean, I think this is the first time I've had someone on my show 3 times. You'll be my first person that I've had on thrice. And I suppose part of the reason for that is because I want to offer you a right of reply.
Alex, is that I think you are a brilliant interviewer, and your ability in cross-examination is incisive. I think that you eviscerated Dawkins' position in that interview, but you did it so sweetly and so gently that I don't think he had any idea of what actually went on. So I appreciate as well your sticking up for me. That means a lot, and so thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, and of course, we come from different sides of the discussion here. But in the interviews that I've had with you, I've let's say, not experienced the same kind of personal issues that Dawkins seems to have in at least his interactions with you, if not in person, through listening to your work in the past. So I was glad to at least just note that those weren't my experiences with you. But I suppose that today we can put some of those interrogation tactics to the test in the other direction, because I would love to speak to you about some of the criticisms that Richard Dawkins has made. I think a lot of people are disappointed, as I said to him, that we don't get to see this forerunner of the New Atheist movement put the criticisms to one of the forerunners of Christian apologetics in the flesh. So I'll try to act like something of a middleman. But before getting into his specific criticisms, I wonder if somebody came to you as a fan of Richard Dawkins, they read The God Delusion, they listened to his debates, and you had to explain to them in a sort of a summary.
Ouch.
What are some of the more egregious mistakes you think he makes? I mean, you mentioned a moment ago that you think he, I can't remember the exact words you used, but in terms of him tackling a topic like philosophy in which he's not an expert, somebody might say, well, what's an example of the kind of thing that you're talking about?
Yes. Well, let me point to 2 things that stuck out to me as a philosopher. First, I thought it was commendable that Professor Dawkins treated the arguments for the existence of God in his book. All too often, the new atheists simply ignored these, and Dawkins, to his credit, interacts with several of the principal theistic arguments. Having said that, however, I thought that his handling of them was just terribly superficial. He didn't show that he's aware of the best work on these arguments. In particular, his handling of the ontological argument was cringeworthy. It was embarrassing. When he said that he raised this objection at a conference of theologians that he attended, and they had to appeal to modal logic in order to answer his objection. And I thought the ontological argument just is an argument framed in the terms of modal logic. So that was unfortunate, I think. And then the other thing that I would mention is that what he calls the central argument.
Oh, no poison.
His argument that concludes, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, is a tissue of fallacies. Even if you granted every one of his points, which are themselves moot, the conclusion doesn't follow from those propositions. So that it was just a horrible argument. The central argument of the book is vacuous. It's a hole.
Well, yeah, for all the talk about atheists simply lacking a belief in God and not having a position, Richard Dawkins does name one of his chapters why there almost certainly is no God. What is the argument that he presents towards that conclusion?
Pardon me?
What is the argument that he presents towards that conclusion?
It's an argument to say that the appearance of design in the natural world is overwhelming. But nevertheless, Darwin has given us an adequate naturalistic explanation of instances of biological design. We don't yet have, he says, a similar explanation in physics for the fine-tuning of the universe for life. But Darwin's success in biology ought to give us confidence that such an explanation will be forthcoming in physics. Therefore, God
very overpowered in this matter.
Well, I would ask you to try to point out some of the fallacies in there, but hopefully the listeners can see why that doesn't follow.
All of the statements that I just summarized are true. All that follows, at best, would be you shouldn't use a design argument to prove God's existence. It says absolutely nothing about whether God exists or not. A person might have quite different grounds for believing in God than the appearance of design. So at the very best, it's simply an argument that one ought not to use, the teleological argument or the argument for design. But then in addition to that, several of the propositions that I mentioned are very questionable. For example, that Darwin has given an adequate explanation for the appearance of design.
Did
The biological
I
realm is controverted. The claim that
lose
that should give us
lethal?
confidence that in a totally different field of science, in
9.
physics and cosmology, that an explanation is right
Nah.
around the corner
Or
for
did I
the
maybe
remarkable fine-tuning of the universe. I don't know of
9,
any physicist
11,
who
13? I was
that
1
that
off
proposition
lethal,
is true. So those would be,
I think.
that's just the faith of a naturalist, Alex, is all that is expressed by that proposition. There's no basis for thinking that that statement is true either.
Do you like reading? If you're anything like me, your book list is exponentially expanding, and there are at least dozens of books that you've been meaning to get around to reading for the past 10 years or so. Sometimes I just want the key information. I just don't have time to read every book that I want to. Well, imagine something like a super-powered book summary mixed together with your smartest friend, Craig. Well, if we were to try to present a softer version of the argument, which doesn't conclude so radically that God almost certainly doesn't exist, but rather says something like, we can have a justifiable optimism about the ability of science in many areas, because Dawkins, of course, points to Darwinism as his principal example, but there are lots of areas of science where it appears that there have been explanations wanted for certain cosmic or biological or chemical events that in the past people have
Yeah,
rightly
he
or wrongly
wins.
attributed to divine agency, which now, although we may not have removed
Probably.
the ability to have divine agency behind the mechanisms that the scientific method has revealed, we at least don't have the mystery of what those mechanisms are and how something like biological complexity can arise. And so I think Richard Dawkins has said to me on my podcast that he sees something like a trajectory, that there are many things which we used to not be able to explain that we can now, and there's no reason to think that this won't continue into the future. Just to illustrate this, the way that I think about this is stepping into a time machine and going 100, 200 years into the future, and somebody's watching this conversation back, and they're saying something like, wow, can you believe that they hadn't worked out, the fine-tuning of the universe yet? Can you believe they hadn't worked out the science of consciousness yet? Wow, isn't that amazing? But what I can't imagine, and that just seems intuitively plausible that somebody could look back in that way. What I can't imagine, however, is somebody going in that time machine, looking back and making the same comment about the sort of atheist case against God, saying, wow, can you believe it, they hadn't worked out the problem of evil yet? Wow, can you believe it, they hadn't worked out divine hiddenness yet? And so the arguments that I put forward for atheism, like the problem of evil and divine hiddenness, it seems more plausible to me that we can be optimistic that science will overcome the mysteries that are often used in promoting God's existence in a way that philosophy is not going to overcome the philosophical challenges to God's existence.
Okay, there's a lot to respond to there. I think you're quite right in saying that such a more modest formulation of the argument would indeed be more defensible and plausible. And the conclusion from that argument is that these sorts of quasi-scientific arguments for God's existence are inconclusive, and that therefore one ought not to believe in God on the basis of, for example, design arguments. But that says nothing at all about other reasons for theism. And as for the confidence that you speak of, perhaps as someone coming from the other side, I think that we've already resolved the problem of evil, that the problem of evil places a burden of proof upon the shoulders of the atheist that is so heavy that no one has been able to sustain it. And so I think there's been tremendous progress in the history of philosophy with regard to these anti-theistic arguments. And so I don't think we need to go in a time machine into the future to see the resolution of these objections to theism. I think we've got them right now. But if we did go into a time machine into the future, I would fully expect, Alex, that there will be philosophical questions about nature and the universe that will remain open questions. And I do not have any confidence at all that this is all going to be simply resolved naturalistically. And as I said, I think that Dawkins' confidence on the basis of Darwin's achievement is greatly exaggerated. We can talk about that more if you want to, but I don't think that contemporary evolutionary theory bears that out at all. It's extremely controverted today, and therefore I think provides no good grounds for thinking that all of these difficult questions are about to be resolved.
Well, I think, as I said to Dawkins, at risk of repeating myself to my audience, I think I agree with his optimism about the trajectory of scientific explanations, but what I don't share with him is the idea that by providing a scientific explanation for a phenomena, you've therefore, let's say, wholly explained it. That is, when Newton describes the laws of gravity, to say that we have a better understanding of how things fall to the ground is true, but to say that we're even a step closer to knowing why things fall to the ground, well, because of gravity. That doesn't seem right to me. It seems that things don't fall to the ground because of the theory of gravity. Rather, we have the theory of gravity because things fall to the ground. And the actual question of why that happens at all still remains an open question. And so I suppose that's where I disagree with Dawkins. I would say, sure, science may one day completely explain the mechanism behind the Big Bang and the foundational laws which tuned the universe, and maybe there's no divine agency there, but I don't think it removes the ability for divine agency to be injected in the same way that Richard Dawkins does.
Oh, well, that's certainly correct, that as an argument against God's existence, it's not sound at all. At best, you would just say that these don't offer evidence for God's existence. And I appreciate your point about the progress of science. I wouldn't in any way want people to misunderstand me to say that I don't believe in the progress of science and that tremendous scientific advances are being made. I mean, right now in physics, the quest for a unified theory of physics is the holy grail that would unite general relativity and quantum mechanics. And so we can look forward, if we had a time machine, to seeing how that will be accomplished in the future, if it will. It may be that the conditions necessary for probing those questions are so extreme that they couldn't be realized here on Earth, and we would run into the limits of science. But I'm not at all pessimistic about the future progress of science. It would just be the point that you're making, that goes no distance toward undermining the rationality of belief in God.
Now, I didn't invite you on the show to spend an hour agreeing with you, so I think now's a good time to move on to the actual criticisms that Dawkins has made, specifically in regards to why he refuses to debate you. As I said before, a lot of people want to see this debate, and I know that you've offered him the opportunity a number of times, and he's turned it down. And he claims that the reason that he does this, whether this be the real reason or not, the reason he gives is that William Lane Craig is an immoral person because he is an apologist for genocide, pointing specifically in his original article and original objection to the issue of the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, which you've defended as a morally defensible thing for God to have commanded and for the Israelites to have enacted. So what I really want to do now is jump into this story. I want to talk about the slaughter of the Canaanites in the Hebrew Bible, what happened, why it's problematic, and what your moral defense is of that story. So perhaps we can begin by talking about who were the Canaanites.
All right. Prior to Israel's liberation from bondage in Egypt, the land of Canaan, or modern-day Israel, was populated by small clans of Canaanite inhabitants. And according to the biblical narrative, these clans of Canaanites were extremely evil. They were debauched morally and opposed God. And God let this go on for 400 years while Israel was in Egypt. But then he called Israel out of Egypt and led them to the land of Canaan and delivered the land over to Israel and said, drive out the Canaanites from the land on pain of death. And I am giving this land to you, to Israel. So they were the pre-Israeli inhabitants of this region of the world on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea.
And as you say, the Old Testament makes it clear that God considered these people to be an immoral people, much in the same way that before the flood of Noah, we sort of have this pleading with God of saying, look, are there not any good people amongst this community? Are you really going to flood the entire world? Is there not one person worth saving? And as far as I know, most people defend God's action here by saying that the answer is no, that the society had become so corrupt that there wasn't any sort of salvageable morality.
What does it do though? Different?
I suppose something like that is going on with the Canaanites here. I suppose...
If I might comment, this is not simply biblically attested. I have a colleague, Professor Clay Jones, who has done a study of literature coming out of pre-Israelite Canaan. And it is horrific, the culture that is described there. This was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple prostitution in the worship of God. They practiced bestiality. There are texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame, and then women would mount the buck and copulate with it. They were engaged in offering child sacrifice to their gods. And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them, though the biblical description doesn't go into that kind of morbid detail that these documents do.
I suppose I intuitively find it difficult to believe that there's not a single person in this community who is not so unsalvageably touched or consumed by sin in this way that the actions we see the Israelites committing on the command of God can be justified. So to give people an idea, to give them the full picture, we've described who the Canaanites are, and I'm sure you'll have something to say about that, but the reason that this is a problem, the reason why Richard Dawkins is talking about these people is because, as you say, God promises this land to the Israelites, and he waits 400 years and says this is because the sin sort of hasn't got bad enough yet, essentially. He says it will happen in 400 years because by that point things will be so bad that this will be sort of justifiably inflicted. But he commands the Israelites to destroy the Canaanites. And the language used in the Bible is quite extreme in a few different areas, talking about completely destroying a city, leaving nothing alive that breathes. And on the point about innocent people, because I know you'll have something to say about that, but we know that there are at least some innocent people among the Canaanites, because in the 6th chapter of Joshua, in the destruction of Jericho, it said that they devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Now, maybe the men and women were immoral. I certainly don't think that children living among the Canaanites were immoral enough to justify their being killed, and certainly not the cattle, the sheep, and the donkeys.
Right. The difficult, I think, aspect of this is the children. The adults were corrupt. If there was an innocent person among the adults, that person didn't have to be killed. It's important to understand that God's command to Israel was not genocide, despite a superficial first reading of these narratives. More fundamentally, it was a command to drive the Canaanites out of the land on pain of death. No one had to be killed if these tribes would simply retreat and flee in the face of the advancing Israeli army. It was only those who tried to stay behind and resist who were to be completely exterminated. So people didn't have to die. They weren't pursued and chased down until everyone was exterminated. These clans were driven out of the land. They would be destroyed as nation states, but not as individual people. And it's important to understand that for these ancient Near Eastern people, as for modern Near Eastern people, it is the land that is so important. It is all about the land. Even today, when you go to Israel,
Is this
people will
playing
talk
a
about
minute?
coming to the land. That's how they refer to it. So what God was doing was giving the land of Canaan from or to Israel and divesting these Canaanite clans of the possession of the land of Canaan. And so they were driven out, and not all of them were killed. Later in the narratives in the Pentateuch, you find Canaanites still about.
Yeah.
So they weren't all killed.
If I may, on this point that we've got to so far, firstly, this idea that, well, not everybody's killed because they're given the opportunity to leave their land. They're given the opportunity to be driven out. It's only if they stay and resist that they get killed. And the way you just cash that out is by saying, so they had a decision and didn't have to die. It seems to me that, of course, you're going to understand this as something that God has commanded. So whatever the reason may be, it must be the morally right thing to do. However, from my perspective, what I'm seeing here is a foreign nation approaching the native inhabitants of land which they believe is their own,
Is this a
saying, "You need to leave,"
beast?
and when they refuse, killing them.
It's
and then saying,
dormant, but
well, I
is
gave you a
it
choice, didn't I? Because you could have just left.
like,
I mean, that in other
does
words,
it
doesn't seem
count
like
as
much of an offense.
each friendly beast?
We were talking about
Let's
whether or
try.
not the Canaanites were corrupt and whether or not this was an act of divine judgment upon them. But I've not explicated here the moral theory that undergirds my defense of this action. It is very possible that had this been undertaken by human initiative alone, that it would have been immoral, as the way you described. But the ethical
it
theory
isn't.
that I defend is called divine command morality. And this has two components to it. First is that the good is based in God himself. God is the paradigm of moral goodness. He is by nature loving, fair, just, and so forth. Second element is that God's nature then expresses itself toward us in the form of divine commands that constitute our moral duties. According to this theory, moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a qualified authority. So, for example, if I were driving and some random person told me to pull over, I wouldn't have any obligation to obey that person at all. But if a policeman commanded me to pull over, then in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey. So what constraint is there then on the moral commands of God? Well, it will be his own perfectly good nature, his own just and loving nature that will determine whether or not a command is available to him. Now, what this means is that there are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he wills. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative. So God doesn't have the same sort of moral constraints that we do because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature. And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil, that there is a sort of internal inconsistency between two propositions affirmed by the Judeo-Christian faith. The first would be that God is all just and all loving. And the second, in this case, would be that God has issued a command to Israel to drive out the Canaanites on pain of death from the land. And so my argument is that those two propositions are completely consistent with each other because God wrongs no one.
One off lethal.
And if he wrongs no one, then there
I
is no
could have maybe had
constraint
lethal.
on
I'm not
his
sure.
issuing such a command.
Now, I see a few problems with this, and I think my listeners will too intuitively. There's nothing I can say to prove that that's wrong, that maybe God can just permit things like the killing of innocent children by an Israelite clan. Maybe that is just okay. But the problems this raises include things like this is raised by Randall Rouser. He points out that this seems to undermine our ability to trust moral intuition. In other contexts, such as in the moral argument of the existence of God, you might appeal to the fact that we all know that certain things are morally right and morally wrong, and we sort of use that feeling to say that there must be some objective element of morality in the universe, and we use that to construct an argument for the existence of God. It seems, as Rouser points out, that nothing could be more intuitively wrong to me in this regard than the killing of an innocent child. And what we're told to believe is that, okay, maybe most of the time that's wrong. Maybe that's always wrong unless it's specifically commanded by God. But sometimes it is actually just okay, as long as God commands it, meaning that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with killing innocent children. It can't be intrinsically wrong if there are circumstances in which it's actually not just permitted, but in fact the thing that you're ordered to do.
I would say that it is wrong in the absence of a divine command, but that God has the ability to override that by issuing a divine command, which then becomes our moral duty. And as long as this ethical theory
It's
is possible,
idiotic.
And coherent, then there just is no inconsistency between his being all good and all loving and his issuing.
Consistent, but it's idiotic. William Lane Craig. Hey. Absolute idiocy.
Requires a lot. Hey everyone, I just started a Substack, so if you're interested in reading my writings, then you can do that right now. There's already stuff to read at alexoconnor.com. You were recently, well, you were banned on Twitch a couple of years ago, and your appeal just got
It gets rejected every 6 months, you know.
Oh, you try again every few months. I saw like online somewhere that it was like last week or something. Your appeal got denied.
No.
You don't know why you were banned, right?
Not officially, but I've got like friends that I think I know I was banned.
Oh yeah. And what did they tell you?
I think it was because I was fighting with, it was a time on Twitch when there was the big debate over trans athletes, not just for Twitch, obviously, it's for the entire United States.
Right.
And my position has been that like if you've gone through puberty and then you transition afterwards, you probably shouldn't be competing at NCAA level or higher.
Sure.
And then I obviously get into lots of fights with lots of people over this. And I think I uttered something along the lines of like, don't waste your time arguing with trans activists on Twitter. They're subhuman. It's not worth it. And I think that apparently that comment got interpreted as me saying like all trans people are subhuman or something. And then they stretched that into like a hate speech ban. Like, oh,
Yeah.
okay.
But they didn't tell you why.
Ooh,
When an email
face.
comes, it just says you've been
Really?
for hate speech or
Right.
hateful conduct. Like, okay.
But you do get to appeal once every 6 months. Is the idea?
Yeah,
Do you think
I
they'll ever reverse that? I mean, it just
No.
seems.
Not unless the culture there significantly changes.
Sure, which could happen at some point. You know, we sort of see this Twitter shift take over, and suddenly, I will say that when Elon Musk took over Twitter and everybody was saying it's going to become this like right-wing cesspit, I did think to myself, come on, like you're not even going to notice. It's like a change of ownership. Like who the hell cares? But I must say that Twitter has recently become
They're only like
a different
50%, right?
It's like yeah, right. It's a totally different beast now. Like opening Twitter, I can feel like something shifted in the air. Something like that could happen at Twitch. I don't know, but don't you think it's a bit outrageous that they can take away someone's livelihood without even needing to tell them why?
I mean, I would obviously say that, yeah, of course.
But like, because you know, a lot of people like to debate the whole sort of private company publisher thing. Like, should social media have sort of, should it be legally bound to protecting free speech and this kind of stuff? But this kind of question really brings it out, because in a sense, you think, well, there's no real way that everybody who ever gets banned for anything, we don't have the resources to put a full sort of investigation, inquiry, and human checking of everything they've ever said and done. But it does seem like for people of a certain size on the platform, people who are significantly depending upon it for their livelihood, like these companies hold so much power that it does feel like they should maybe begin to occupy a different legal category. I don't know what you think social media companies like are in this debate about sort of, you know, publishers, private companies, sort of pseudo new public squares. Like, what do you think social media platforms actually are?
I mean, I think the private companies, I think they have the right to do as they wish. Now, obviously, there's a difference between what do you have the right to do versus what ought you do. Everybody has the right to lie and cheat on partners, but I mean, should you do it? Probably not. Private companies probably should have the right to ban who they want and not ban who they don't want to. I do agree that it's a little bit scary that like the public square has obviously moved on to social media companies, and there are certain political strains of thought that at least, especially over COVID, was probably one of the worst, that seem to be getting like deleted from a lot of public spaces. And there's a legitimate question to ask about, you know, what does your right to speech mean if you have no platforms on which to speak? I think there's a legitimate question to be asked there. But I think the reason why we don't hear about this too much is because, one, I think these companies do largely try to stay within the realm of appeasing like 98% of people.
This is way too good.
For as much as I, don't like being banned and all that, most people that get banned from these platforms probably need to be banned, right? Like 99% of people that get banned need to be banned.
sure.
Like if you go through for every like one, like, oh my god, that was so unfair. It's like people spamming the N-word or whatever stuff. And then it seems like when there's enough blowback, I do like that social media has kind of like tended more towards the community note or like the little YouTube note at the bottom as opposed to just like straight banning content or delisting it. So hopefully it continues to tend in that direction.
Are you signed up to be one of the reviewers of community notes? I remember when community notes first came out, I clicked some button or something which they were looking for the people who actually come up with them, right? And I've never contributed, so they should probably get rid of me from it at some point. But it means that I see about 10 or 15 times more posts that are community noted. I see suggested community notes. Are you signed up for this as well? Do you have this?
No, but a lot of people in my fan base are, so I see that. Yeah, and you
It's
can,
so
like,
fascinating, man, because
okay.
what you're seeing people argue in real time about sort of what a sort of fair bit of context is, and they're often just sort of calling each other like slurs. So they're just like, you're just being the stupidest person I've heard. This is obviously not necessary for a node or something. It's really fascinating to see what people actually are debating as relevant there. But it is always just going to be some arbitrary decision that people make as to whether something is needs noting, whether it should be banned, whether it shouldn't. And I think to myself, like, yeah, I'm thinking about like the development of governments over time and how there was a time when there was basically just rich people and poor people, landed people and serfs. And at some point, people just decided there's this sort of institution, this thing that we're sort of calling government, the people who govern it. And we just think there's something so significant about the fact that they sort of own this public square, they own the land that we all live on, they own the spaces in which we interact, that we should just come up with these special rules about this particular organization and institution that say things like, they're not allowed to tell us, what we can and can't say. They're not allowed to tell us what our, beliefs are going to be about religion and this kind of stuff. And people just agree that because this institution is so powerful, it needs certain rules. And it's develops over a very long time. And eventually we sort of come to a rough agreement that there are certain things that governments can't do because of just the nature of what a
That's
government
cool.
is. It's a very particular kind of
That's
organization.
very good.
I'm thinking social media's been around for like a couple of decades, and it's already proving itself to be so significant that in this debate about, is it a private company or is it not, I feel like there's maybe space for beginning to treat it as its own unique sui generis type of organization that is a bit like something that does own the new public square. And because of that, it seems too straightforward to just say it's a private company, it can do what it wants, especially because social media is not, people often call it the public square. It's not the public square, because the public square, you don't get to control who comes in and out. You sort of show up and there you are. It's like a public square that you, without even realizing that you're doing it, sort of only allow in a certain kind of person who will interact with you in a certain kind of way. I mean, these algorithms are infinitely more intelligent than we're possibly capable of understanding. And so as much as you think you're sort of, oh, I'm trying to follow people from every side, I'm trying to engage in the debates, it knows how many milliseconds you spend looking at this and this. It knows how you sort of interact with it. It knows what you like. And so it's not so much a public square. It's like this self-reinforcing walled garden that keeps out everything. Not that you don't like, but that you don't sort of engage with and interact with and want to interact with in some way. This is like a unique beast, surely. And I feel like just saying, like, look, man, it's a private company, they should be able to sort of ban who they like. Feels like it doesn't take into account how serious of a shift this is in the history of our species, really.
I think that when the United States was being created, I think that you had a unique opportunity in time where you had incredibly intelligent people coming together to basically build what they thought was like the best type of government possible. This wasn't done strictly by democracy. You didn't have a ton of peasants and ordinary people just voting on every single provision of the Constitution. You didn't have a ton of people that didn't really know why they were there, giving opinions on what should be or what shouldn't be, included in the federal government and the Constitution. You had like a very intentional process by people that were working from first principles to try to draft what they saw as a government that would execute on the things that they all collectively felt were the most important things to execute on. And I agree with you that I think that social media's companies, I think the internet in general is kind of like a paradigm shift to where we're accelerating and moving in ways that are a little bit outside of what's happened over the past like 150, 200 years. And that as part of that paradigm shift, I think it's pretty easy to argue that our current like structure of government and the way that we approach legislation doesn't really encapsulate well how to deal with these things, right? Like, well, should a private company be forced to host a certain type of speech? Well, we probably shouldn't be able to force them to host a certain type of speech. That makes sense when the private company, is like 2 offices and a couple cities. But it's interesting when if you get delisted, if like 4 companies don't like you, you essentially have no voice, right? Like if YouTube decides that you're banned, if Twitter decides that you're banned, and if Facebook decides that you're banned, that's like probably like 80% of like your reach, or depending on what field you're in, it could be like 95% of your reach. It's just completely gone. I think that the issue though is that when we go to there's like 2 things. We can either kind of like try to squeeze it into our current legislative framework, which is essentially what we have to do because we're not going to go back to the drawing board. So we either squeeze it into our currently existing framework, or 2, we try to kind of like redesign the framework a little bit to make it more adaptable. But the issue is that now we can't work with a group of learned people from first principles. Now we have a democracy that I don't know if 80% of the people in the United States even know why we have the things that we do have. So how can you possibly argue for anything relating to what a company ought to look like when this country is torn in half over what free speech ought to look like, or what a private company ought to look like, or what a collectivized set of rights ought to be, how they ought to be protected or doled out to people. So yeah, I think that because we've spent so much time not really defending the foundations of our country, like, is liberalism good? Do we need to go to more like a populist government? Is capitalism evil? Should we be more collective? Like,
Okay.
we don't have answers to that. How are we
I'll
possibly come
wait
together to create a framework from one of those first principles
for
to
2 more days and
Government's
then
quite different because
do a
it has
weekly,
monopoly on
I
power.
guess.
This is the thing that makes it like totally different to any other kind of organization. It can like hold a gun to your head and force you to do things in a way that companies
Yeah,
can't.
that's
They
it
sort
for
of
now.
a different kind of power, and maybe an equally important kind of power, but it's different for that reason. But like, this always
Good
seems like a
night.
long series of historical struggles.
Have you seen, I think they've and I was like, oh, damn it, man. Like, just a lot of the time there's a belief that the material world is created by an evil demiurge, and that the real sort of true God is this spiritual entity that exists in the realm above, but the material world is created by an either evil or incompetent sort of demiurge means craftsman.
Just so I'm on brand, this is the one that says that the God of the Old Testament is different to the God of the New Testament.
Yeah, so a lot of Gnostics believe that the God of the Old Testament